black carriage stopped at the edge of a dirt road in Greystone Falls, Montana. It was a Tuesday morning in October. The air smelled like frost and dead leaves. A woman stood at the window of a small wooden house watching through the glass. She did not move. She did not breathe right either. She had not been expecting anyone. Her name was Eliza Voss. She was 34 years old, unmarried, living in the house where she was born. Most people in Greystone Falls knew her name. Not a single one of them truly knew her. Her father had died 2 winters ago. Her mother followed him the spring after, as if the world without him was simply too much effort to stay in. And her brother Thomas, the only person who had ever seen Eliza clearly, the only one who never made her feel like a problem to be solved. Thomas had been gone for 3 years now. A fever took him in less than 2 weeks. It moved so fast it felt less like illness and more like robbery. The man who stepped out of the carriage wore a dark coat and carried his hat in his hand. He was tall. His face was serious in the way of a man who had once known how to smile and had simply stopped practicing. He walked up the stone path slowly. He did not look at the house the way visitors usually do, with curiosity or judgment. He looked at it like a man arriving somewhere he had been putting off for a long time. Eliza met him in the sitting room, not the parlor. The parlor still smelled like her mother's dried flowers, and she was not ready to take a stranger in there. He sat across from her, straight in his chair. For a long moment he said nothing. He looked at the cold fireplace like it held an answer he was still searching for. Then he spoke. "My name is Edmund Rowe. I was your brother's closest friend." He paused. "I don't know if he told you that." Eliza looked at him steadily. "He told me you were the most stubborn man he'd ever met." Something shifted in Edmund's face. Not a smile. The shadow of one. "That sounds right," he said. The silence after that was real, not polite, not uncomfortable. Just heavy with everything neither of them had said yet. Outside the window, a crow landed on the bare oak tree in the yard, stayed for 3 seconds, left. Edmund reached into his coat. He placed an envelope on the table between them. The paper was cream-colored. The corners were slightly worn, as if it had been picked up and set down many times before finally being brought here. Eliza's name was written on the front in her brother's handwriting. That slanted familiar script she had not seen in 3 years. The sight of it hit her below the ribs, quiet, sudden. Like a stone dropped into still water. She did not reach for it. Edmund watched her. He did not rush. "He wrote it 2 weeks before he died," Edmund said. "He gave it to me with very specific instructions." A pause. "He asked me to give it to you only if certain circumstances arose." Eliza looked up. "What circumstances?" Edmund held her gaze. "If you were still alone, and if I was still alone," he straightened. "He asked me to come in person, not a lawyer, not a letter. He was very specific about that." Eliza's hands pressed flat against her knees. "He always thought he could arrange everything," she said quietly. "He could," Edmund said. She read the letter alone. She took it to the kitchen, where the morning light came through the small window above the sink and left a pale rectangle on the stone floor. She stood inside that rectangle of light because she needed to feel something warm. Thomas's letter was 4 pages long. He wrote the way he always spoke, direct, without decoration but warm underneath every line. He told her things she already knew, that she was braver than she believed, that she had spent too many years making herself small to fit other people's expectations, that this, the smallness, was the one thing about her he had never admired. Then he told her things she did not know. He told her about Edmund Rowe, that Edmund had lost his wife 4 years ago, a woman named Clara, 28 years old, lost in childbirth along with the child, that Edmund had not recovered the way people recover. He had not moved forward, he had not sought comfort. He had simply continued, existing in a very controlled and airless way. The way a man lives when he has decided that feeling things is something he can no longer afford. Thomas wrote, "He is not cold, he just forgot how to be warm. You are the only person I know who could remind him." Then, in the careful handwriting Thomas always used when he was being most serious, he asked her to consider Edmund's proposal. Not as a command, not even a request. More like a suggestion from someone who loved both of them and was no longer there to protect either of them. He wrote, "I am not asking you to love him right away. I am asking you to let him try. And I am asking you to be honest, because you are always honest, even when it cost you, about whether there is something there worth building." The last line of the letter was this: "I am sorry I could not stay, but I picked the best person I know to stand in the gap I left. Trust me one last time." Eliza stood in the kitchen for a long time after she finished. The light shifted. A kettle she had forgotten began to whistle. She lifted it off the heat and stood there holding it, not pouring, just holding the warmth of it against her palms. She thought about the word they used for women like her in this town. Spinster, always from someone else's mouth. Always with that particular tone, not cruel enough to call out, not kind enough to forgive. As if her unmarried life was something that had happened to her. Not something she had chosen, year after careful year, because nothing had ever felt worth the risk. She thought about Edmund Rowe sitting in her cold sitting room, hat in his hands, eyes on the empty fireplace. She thought about her brother, who had loved her enough to plan for her from the edge of his own death. She set the kettle down, straightened her shoulders, walked back down the hall. Edmund stood the moment she entered the room. That small thing stopped her for just a second, the standing up. It was a habit so deep in him it had survived everything, grief, years, the long business of becoming someone who no longer expected much from the world. She sat, she placed the folded letter on the table between them. She looked at him, really looked. For the first time since he had arrived, he let her. He did not fidget. He did not fill the quiet. She said, "I have one condition," he said. "Name it." "Honesty," she said. "About everything. I have spent my whole life being agreeable and invisible. I am finished with that. If this is going to work, it has to be real." Edmund was quiet. Then he said, "Thomas told me you would say something like that." Eliza blinked. "What did he say?" For the first time since he walked through her gate, Edmund Rowe smiled. Small, careful, like a door that had not been opened in years. "He said you were the most honest person he had ever known." A pause. "And he said that was either going to make this very easy or very hard." Eliza held his gaze. "Which do you think it will be?" Edmund turned his hat once in his hands. Then he looked at her, directly, without pretense, and said, "Both. I think it will be both." Outside, the October wind moved through the bare oak tree. The crow did not come back. But the envelope on the table was open now. And something in the cold sitting room of Greystone Falls had shifted. Quietly, permanently. Like a door not fully closed, finally being pushed all the way to. The wedding was small. No flowers ordered from the city. No guests in pressed suits whispering opinions behind their hands. Just the old church at the edge of Greystone Falls. A vicar who had known Eliza since she was 7, and 2 witnesses. Edmund's lawyer, a thin, quiet man named Mr. Fitch. Calloway, Eliza's neighbor of 20 years, who cried through the entire ceremony with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been waiting a long time for something good to happen to someone who deserved it. Eliza wore her mother's ivory dress, altered at the waist. It smelled faintly of cedar and something floral she could not name. Some old perfume soaked so deep into the fabric that no amount of airing had ever fully removed it. She bought 2 small pearl clips the morning before the ceremony, stood at the jeweler's counter, and paid for them herself. There was something quietly defiant about that small act. Something that felt entirely her own. Edmund wore dark gray. He stood at the front of the church with his hands clasped behind his back. When she walked in, 11 pews, it took no time at all. He turned and watched her come toward him. His expression was not the bright performance of a happy groom. It was quieter than that, more considered. Like a man making a decision he intended to keep, they said their vows in steady voices, both of them. Outside after, in the thin October sunlight, Mrs. Calloway pressed Eliza's hands between both of hers. "Your Thomas would have been so pleased," she said. "The grammatical slips so warm so entirely, Mrs." Calloway tightened Eliza's throat in a way the ceremony itself had not. She squeezed the old woman's hands. "He would have made a terrible fuss about it," she said. Calverton Ranch sat 3 hours north of Greystone Falls by carriage. The land around it rolled dark and long against the sky. The trees along the approach road had lost most of their leaves, standing with their bare arms out like people who had given everything they had. The house itself was large, larger than Eliza had prepared herself for. Built from pale gray stone that looked silver in certain light and almost bone-white in others. It had more rooms than she could count on her first walk through. High ceilings, tall windows, cold drafts and surprising light. There was a library on the second floor. When Eliza stepped into it that first evening, she went completely still. The smell hit her first. Old wood, ink, dust. Something faintly sweet, like tobacco stored long ago in a closed chest. It was the exact smell of her brother's study back in Greystone Falls. She pressed one hand against the doorframe. Edmund was standing a few feet behind her, holding a lamp. He said nothing. He simply waited until she was ready to move again. Then he followed her. That, she thought, was something. The first weeks were careful. There is no more honest word for it. They were 2 people who had agreed to share a life and were now in the slow, slightly awkward process of figuring out what that meant on a Wednesday afternoon when there was nothing ceremonial left to perform. They ate breakfast together each morning. Edmund took his coffee black and read the newspaper in silence. Not the cold silence of a man who wished to be left alone, more the quiet of someone who had always done things this way and had not yet learned it could be different. Eliza drank her tea and looked out at the frost on the garden. She did not try to fill every pause with conversation. She was finished with that, but slowly, without planning, the breakfast began to change. It started the morning Edmund mentioned an article about a botanical expedition along the southern coast. Eliza said, without thinking, that her brother had once tried to grow tropical plants on his bedroom windowsill as a boy. Kept it secret an entire winter before their mother found the soil on the sill. Edmund looked up from his paper. That small rusty smile crossed his face. "I know," he said. "He told me." He was extraordinarily proud of himself. And just like that, they were talking about Thomas. Not in the careful way people speak of the dead, full of soft pauses and managed grief. They talked about him the way you talk about someone you genuinely knew, with affection, with exasperation, with the particular warmth that comes from having watched someone be entirely, imperfectly themselves. Edmund told her about the time Thomas had challenged him to a horse race along the lower road in the dark, how Thomas had miscalculated the fence at the bottom of the hill by a significant distance. Eliza laughed so suddenly and completely that she knocked her teacup with her elbow. Edmund caught it before it fell. The reflexes of a man who had spent years managing Thomas-related disasters. They both went still, her hand still out, his hand still around the cup, the tea settling back to level. Then they both started laughing at the same time. The kind of laughter that unlocks something, opens a door you forgot was closed. For a moment, the dining room of Calverton Ranch felt less like a museum and more like somewhere people actually lived. But hope is never a straight line. Anyone who has lived long enough knows that. It doubles back, it stalls. Sometimes it sits down in the middle of the road and refuses to move. About 6 weeks into the marriage, Eliza found the room. She had not been looking for it. She needed to move. The November rain had been hitting the windows all afternoon in long gray sheets, and Edmund was away in town on business, and the house was very quiet in the way that large empty houses become quiet. She walked the east corridor. The door at the end had been left slightly open. A cold draft touched her hand. She pushed it gently. It was a nursery, small, pale yellow walls, faded now, the color of very old butter. A white crib against one wall, made up with blankets that had never been used. A rocking horse in the corner, unpainted wood, one ear slightly chipped, a mobile hanging from the ceiling. Hand-carved birds on thin wire, perfectly still in the cold air of the room. On the windowsill sat a small glass jar. Inside it, pressed flat and dry, was a single white flower. Eliza did not know what kind. She only knew it had been placed there with great care, by someone who had no other way to hold what they were carrying. She stood in the doorway for a long time. She did not go in. The room was not hers to enter, not yet, maybe not ever. But she stood there, and she felt Edmund's grief the way you feel cold coming off a stone wall in winter. Not through touch, through proximity, the simple fact of standing close enough to it. When she heard the carriage on the gravel that evening, she was back in the library with a book open in her lap. She said nothing about the room. Edmund said nothing about his day. They ate dinner. They talked about the book, a history of 3 generations of a ranching family in the north, and Edmund said the second generation was the most interesting. And Eliza disagreed, and they argued about it pleasantly for 20 minutes while the fire burned down around them. But before she said goodnight, Eliza paused in the doorway of the sitting room. Edmund was reaching to turn down the lamp, she said without planning it. "I'm sorry about Clara and the child. I don't think anyone has said that to you plainly enough." Edmund's hand stilled on the lamp. He did not turn around immediately. When he did, his face was doing something complicated. The look of a man deciding in real time how much of himself he is willing to let be seen. He said very quietly, "Thomas told you the letter," she said. "Yes." A long pause. The fire crackled once. The house was very still. Edmund said, "Thank you, Eliza," not her full name the way he usually said it, just Eliza. Simple, direct, like something set down after being carried for a very long time. She nodded once, said goodnight, walked up the stairs, and in the quiet space between that moment and morning, something inside Calverton Ranch shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. More like a house that had been holding its breath for 4 years, and had just, very carefully, begun to breathe again. Winter came to Calverton Ranch the way it always did in the north. Not gradually, not politely, all at once, like a decision made somewhere else and simply arriving to be carried out. One morning the ground was iron hard. The sky was the color of old pewter. The oak trees along the drive stood so still they looked painted against the white. Eliza had never lived through a winter in a house this large. She had not anticipated how much the cold would echo. But she was not unhappy. That surprised her more than anything else about her new life. She had expected friction, discomfort, the strange weight of learning to exist alongside a man who was essentially a stranger wearing the face of someone her brother had loved. What she had not expected was this: the slow, unglamorous, deeply ordinary process of simply becoming, without fanfare, without a single definitive moment she could point to, comfortable. She rearranged the library. Edmund did not object. He stood in the doorway one afternoon and watched her shift a heavy stack of cartography books from the lower shelf to the higher one. She asked if she was offending any particular system of organization. He said the previous system had been no system at all, just accumulation. He told her to do exactly as she liked. That word, liked, not wished, not deemed appropriate, liked as if her preferences were simply a fact of the house now. As natural as the direction the windows faced. Small things, all of it small things. But Eliza had lived long enough to know that small things are never actually small. They are the real architecture of a life. The grand gestures are just decoration. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday in January, no special occasion. No date that would later seem meaningful. There had been a light snow overnight, just enough to soften the edges of the garden, round off the sharp corners of the world. Eliza had come downstairs early and built the fire herself. She had always found it clarifying, the selecting of the wood, the careful placement, the patience required before the flame decides to commit. Edmund came down to find the fire already going. Eliza sat in the chair closest to it, hands wrapped around her cup, eyes on the middle distance. He poured his coffee. He sat across from her. Then, without preamble, he said, "I owe you an explanation." Eliza looked at him. "You don't owe me anything. I think I do." He turned his cup slowly in his hands, that gesture she had come to know as his way of collecting himself. "I have been a fair husband in most practical ways, but I have not been fully honest with you. And you asked me for honesty on the very first day." She waited. He said, "When Thomas first asked me in the last weeks, when we both knew what was coming, I said no." A pause. "I said no quite firmly. I told him it was a sentimental idea from a man who wasn't thinking clearly. I said it was unfair to you, unfair to me." He looked up. "I said a great many reasonable things," Eliza said quietly, "but you came anyway." "I came anyway," he agreed. A year and a half later, not because I had changed my mind, but because I had spent a year and a half being correct about everything, and it had made me absolutely miserable. He said it without self-pity. Just a reported fact. I came because I was tired of being sensible about a life that felt like an empty room, and because I had made a promise to a dying man, and I find I cannot break those. I have tried." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Outside, a small bird landed on the snow-covered garden wall, left 3 tiny prints, and was gone. She said, "Can I tell you something I have not told you?" He nodded. "I was angry at Thomas," she said. "Not at first. At first, I only cried. But later, after I had thought about it for several days, I was genuinely angry." She looked at the fire. "Because he arranged it all so neatly, so cleverly, and I thought, what if I had wanted to be alone? What if I had already made peace with my life exactly as it was? He never asked me. He simply decided from wherever he was that he knew better." She paused. "And the most infuriating thing is that he did. He did know better, and I will never get to tell him that. And sometimes that feels like the hardest part of all of it." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then very quietly he said, "I told him the same thing at his grave last spring, a breath. I stood there like a complete fool and told him he was presumptuous and manipulative, and that his plan had absolutely no guarantee of working." A pause. "He would have laughed, I think." Eliza smiled at the grammar. "That soft, familiar slip, would have, the same way Mrs. Calloway said it, the same way Thomas himself said it when he was tired or emotional. He would have laughed," she agreed, "and then he would have said, 'Told you so.'" "Yes," Edmund said. Insufferable to the last. They sat with that for a while. The fire settled into its steady rhythm. The snow in the garden was very white, very still. There was no performance in the room, no effort. Just 2 people sitting in the truth of a complicated situation and finding, somewhat to their own surprise, that the truth was bearable. More than bearable. There was something in the bearing of it together that felt like the closest thing to relief that either of them had known in a very long time. It was the following week that Edmund took her to the nursery himself. He knocked on the library door one afternoon, asked if she would come with him, led her down the east corridor without a word. She followed without asking. When he opened the door, the pale yellow room was exactly as she remembered. The crib, the rocking horse, the mobile of carved birds turning slowly in the air that entered with them. Edmund stood in the center of the room. He looked around it with the expression of a man doing something that required more courage than it appeared to from the outside. He said her name was Clara Margaret. She was 28 years old. She liked very spicy food, which always surprised me because she was a gentle person in most other ways. She was frightened of moths, specifically moths, not other insects, just moths. His voice stayed steady. She read slower than anyone I have ever met. She went back and reread every paragraph she loved before moving on. A single book could take her 3 months. He stopped, swallowed, continued. The child was a girl. We had not chosen a name. I have always regretted that. It felt like I had failed to make her real by not having something ready to call her. Eliza looked at the mobile above the crib. 6 carved birds, each one slightly different. Each made with the hands of someone who had put something of themselves into the making. "Did you make those?" she asked. "The winter after," he said. "I needed something to do with my hands." Eliza walked to the windowsill. She looked at the small glass jar. The pressed white flower inside it, dry and perfect. "What kind of flower is this?" "Clematis," he said. "Clara planted them along the south wall our first summer here. They come back every year. I cut one every spring." A pause. "I don't entirely know why I keep doing it. It just seems important that something continues." Eliza turned to look at him. He was standing in the center of the room, hands at his sides. The posture of a man who has said the most honest things he knows how to say and is now simply waiting to see what becomes of them. She said, "I think you should name her." Edmund looked at her. "The child," Eliza said. "It is not too late. Names don't require ceremonies or records. They just require someone to say them out loud." She held his gaze. "You said you regret not giving her one, so give her one now. You are allowed to do that." Edmund was very still. The mobile turned slowly above the empty crib. Outside, the winter light was going, the sky shifting from white to the pale blue-gray that comes just before dark. He said, "Rose." "I always thought Rose." Eliza said it back to him, "Rose," simply, firmly, like a thing being placed where it always should have been. Something moved through Edmund's face that she had not seen before. Not happiness exactly. The expression of a man who has been carrying a stone for 4 years and has just been shown, gently, without fanfare, that he is allowed to set it down. His eyes went wet. He did not turn away. He did not hide it. He just stood there in the pale yellow room and let it be exactly what it was. Eliza did not cross the room. She did not reach for his hand. She simply stood by the windowsill, present and steady, because sometimes that is what a person needs most. Not comfort. Company. The simple evidence that they are not alone with the hardest parts of themselves. Spring came. The clematis on the south wall returned, white and determined, climbing the old stone like it had somewhere important to be. The library had been reorganized twice by then. The east wing door stayed open most days now. The breakfast table had become the place of real arguments about books, about land management, about whether the rocking horse in the nursery ought to be painted or left as it was. Edmund said painted, Eliza said leave it. Neither had yielded. So it stayed unpainted wood, one ear slightly chipped, exactly as Thomas would have wanted it. One morning in April, Eliza was cutting the clematis for the jar. She had taken over the small annual task without discussion. Edmund had let her, which she understood to be its own kind of answer. He came to stand beside her in the garden, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. They stood together in the early light, looking at the wall of white flowers, and he said, "Do you think he knew?" How close he got it, Eliza thought about the letter. 4 worn pages, that slanted, careful handwriting. Her brother, impractical, stubborn, certain about things he had no rational right to be certain about. She said, "I think he knew exactly. And I think wherever he is absolutely unbearable about it." Edmund handed her the coffee. Their fingers touched briefly on the handle of the cup, an ordinary moment, unremarkable. The 10,000th small moment in a life being built from honest materials. He said, "Probably." Above them the clematis moved in the April wind, white and persistent, coming back, the way things do when they are rooted deep enough to survive even the longest winter.